You found the words. Finally, after days, maybe weeks, of carrying something you couldn't name, you found the words. You sat across from someone you trusted. You took a breath, and you tried to explain what it feels like inside your head, what it actually feels like, not the surface version, the real one. And they listened. They nodded. They said something kind, and you smiled and said thank you. And then you went home and sat in the silence of being completely, utterly, still not understood. Not because they didn't care, not because you explained it wrong, but because what lives inside you does not have a direct translation into any language another person can fully receive. And somewhere along the way, you stopped trying. In the next 15 minutes, I am going to tell you something that no one in your life has probably said to you directly. Being chronically misunderstood is not a communication problem. It is not a personality flaw. It is not evidence that you are too much, too complicated, or too difficult to love. It is a translation problem. And translation problems have a completely different solution than communication problems. By the time this ends, you will understand exactly why the explaining never works. You will understand what has been happening in the gap between what you say and what others receive. You will understand the specific cost of going silent, and you will have a different way of thinking about being known, one that does not require anyone else to fully understand you in order for you to feel less alone. Let me describe something you know. You are in a conversation. Someone asks how you are doing, and for a moment, just a moment, you consider telling the truth. The actual truth, not the fine version, not the summarized version. The version that would take an hour to explain properly and still might not land. And in that fraction of a second, you do a calculation. You assess the room. You assess the person. You assess the cost. And you say, I'm okay, just tired. Because the alternative, the attempt, costs something you are not sure you have left. You have tried before. You have opened up before. You have given someone the full version, the honest version, the version that took real courage to say out loud, and you watched their face. You watched them try. You watched them offer back something smaller, something simpler, something that fit their understanding, but not your experience. And you nodded, and you said yes, exactly, even though it wasn't. Even though what they gave back was a sketch of something that lives in you as an entire world. That silence afterward, the one that follows a failed attempt at being known, is one of the loneliest sounds there is. Because it is the silence of someone who tried to build a bridge and discovered mid-construction that the other shore does not exist in the same geography. Here is what is actually happening, and it matters that you understand this precisely, because the misdiagnosis of this experience has been costing you. There is a concept in psychology called alexithymia, not in the clinical sense, stay with me, but in a broader, more human sense, the difficulty of translating internal emotional experience into external language. Most people have an emotional vocabulary of perhaps 30 to 50 words. Happy, sad, angry, scared, overwhelmed. They use these words and they feel roughly understood because the person they are speaking to has a matching internal library. The word maps to the feeling. The bridge holds. But some people with complex, layered interior worlds, do not experience emotion in 30 categories. They experience it in 300. The specific quality of missing someone who is still alive. The particular exhaustion of being competent in a room where no one sees the effort. The grief of a version of yourself you had to leave behind to survive. These are not unusual emotions. They are granular emotions. And the language that exists for them was not built for precision at that level. So when you try to explain, you reach for the closest word, and the closest word is always slightly wrong. It is like trying to describe a color to someone who has only ever seen black and white. You can get close. You can say warm, or deep, or electric. But the actual experience of red cannot be transmitted through description alone. This is not a failure of communication. This is a failure of translation. And there is a second layer, beyond vocabulary, beyond language. People with complex inner worlds do not just feel differently, they process differently. The experience of an event, a conversation, a loss, a moment of beauty, a small cruelty runs through more layers of internal processing before it settles. It connects to older things. It expands into pattern recognition. It carries philosophical weight. It arrives in the body before it arrives in thought. When they try to explain this experience to someone who processes more linearly, they are not just sharing a feeling. They are trying to share an entire architecture, and architecture cannot be conveyed in a sentence. Neuroscience offers us something else here. The default mode network, the part of the brain active during self-reflection, imagination, and internal narrative, is measurably more active in people who report chronic feelings of misunderstanding. Their brains are quite literally running more simultaneously. More connections firing, more associations forming, more of the interior landscape lit up at once. This is not a disorder. It is a different kind of cognitive architecture, but it creates a specific isolation because the people around them are not seeing what they see, are not feeling what they feel, are not processing what they process. And so the explanation always falls short, not because the explainer is inadequate, because the map they are trying to share is larger than any conversation can hold. I want to tell you about a man named Daniel. Daniel is 41. He works in a field that requires logic and precision. He is good at it, respected. He has a wife who loves him, friends who value him. A life that, from the outside, contains every ingredient of a person who should feel known. But Daniel has a recurring experience that he has never told anyone about. Not fully. After social gatherings, dinners, celebrations, evenings with people he likes, he drives home feeling a specific kind of empty. Not sad, not ungrateful. Empty in the way that a person feels empty after spending an entire evening performing a version of themselves that is accurate but incomplete. Like wearing a coat that is almost the right size, functional, presentable, but never quite fitting. He has tried to explain this to his wife. She is kind and attentive, and she genuinely tried to understand. She said, "You just need more alone time. You're an introvert." And he nodded, because she was trying, because she was close. But the thing she named was not quite the thing he meant. It was not about needing solitude. It was about the specific grief of being surrounded by people who see you and still somehow being invisible to them. The grief of being liked but not known. Over time, Daniel stopped trying to explain that distinction. Not because he gave up on his wife, because he concluded, quietly and without drama, that the thing he was trying to describe simply did not have a recipient in his life. So he kept it. He added it to the collection of experiences that lived only inside him. Fully real, completely unwitnessed, and the collection grew, not into resentment, into a kind of solitary confinement that he had built himself, brick by brick, with every attempt at explanation that fell short. So what do you do with this? If the problem is translation and not communication, if the gap is architectural and not personal, what changes? 3 things. Step 1. Stop mistaking partial understanding for failure. Here is the shift that changes everything. Partial understanding is not a failed attempt at full understanding. It is the only kind of understanding that exists between any two people, ever. No one has ever been fully known by another person, not completely, not down to the last layer. What you have been measuring yourself against, the standard of being completely, perfectly understood, does not exist. Not for you, not for anyone. The person who seems effortlessly understood is simply someone whose inner world maps more closely onto the available language. Their experience fits the words. Yours exceeds them. That is not a deficit. That is a different scale. When you stop expecting full translation and start receiving partial connection as real, something loosens. The conversation you had, the one where they got it almost right, becomes enough. Not everything, but enough. Step 2. Find the 1% who speak the same language. There are people who will understand you. Not everyone, not even most people, but they exist. And finding one of them is worth more than being partially understood by 100. The research on this is clear. Social connection quality matters infinitely more than quantity. One relationship in which you feel genuinely seen does more for psychological well-being than 20 relationships of surface-level warmth. The people who understand you are not found by explaining more. They are found by going deeper, faster, in the right directions. They reveal themselves when you say the specific thing, the granular, precise, slightly vulnerable thing, instead of the safe general version. When you say, "I feel like I'm wearing a coat that almost fits," and someone says, "Yes, I know exactly what that means," that person exists. Stop spending your energy trying to translate yourself for people who do not share your frequency. Spend it finding the ones who do. Step 3. Become your own most fluent translator. This is the step that no one talks about. The reason the silence after a failed explanation hurts so much is not only because you weren't understood by them. It is because some part of you was hoping that saying it out loud would help you understand it too. That the act of translating your inner world for someone else would clarify it for yourself. That is a real and legitimate need, but it cannot be outsourced. The work of understanding your own interior is yours, not because no one else can help, but because no one else has access. Write it down, not for an audience, for yourself, the specific thing, the granular thing, the thing that never quite fits in a sentence when someone else is listening. Say it to yourself first, in full, without editing for reception, without softening for someone else's comfort, without shortening because you are afraid of taking up too much space. The full version. When you become fluent in your own language, the silence after a failed explanation changes. It stops feeling like rejection. It starts feeling like information. They could not receive this. That is about capacity, not worth. And you already have the full text. I need to say this clearly. The fact that you are difficult to understand is not evidence that you are too much. It is evidence that you contain more than the available containers were built to hold. The people who stopped trying to explain themselves, who went quiet, who retreated into the private architecture of their inner world, did not do so because they gave up. They did so because they were protecting something. The experience of reaching for connection and finding the hand isn't quite there is one of the more quietly painful things a person can endure. Repeatedly, over years, and the decision to stop reaching, that is not weakness. That is a nervous system doing its job, protecting you from a specific kind of grief that has no obvious wound and no social permission. But here is what that protection costs. The parts of you that went silent did not disappear. They are still there, still forming, still generating experience that needs somewhere to go. The silence is not peace, it is postponement. And the weight of everything postponed becomes its own kind of exhaustion. You deserve to be known, not by everyone, but by someone. Starting with yourself. The next time you are in a conversation and you do that calculation by that fraction of a second assessment of whether it is worth trying, I want you to notice something. Notice that the calculation itself is a kind of self-knowledge. You know your own interior well enough to know when a room can hold it and when it cannot. That is not pessimism. That is precision. The problem was never that you couldn't explain yourself. The problem was that you were trying to build a cathedral in a conversation that only had space for a sentence. Some things cannot be said quickly. Some things require the right listener. Some things require you to write them down at midnight with no audience and no expectation of being received. Just the act of giving them form. Just the act of saying, "This is real. This happened inside me. This is true." And that act of self-witness is where being known actually begins. Not in the conversation that almost worked. In the moment you stopped waiting for permission to be the full version of yourself. We will talk next time about what happens to the people who spend a lifetime being strong for everyone else. The ones who became so good at holding space for others that they forgot, or were never taught, that they were allowed to need space too. The cost of that, where it starts, and what it feels like when the person who always held everyone else together finally, quietly, comes apart. If this reached something in you, sit with it. You don't need to explain it to anyone, not yet. Just let it be true.